Let's be honest. Love them or hate them, I think we can all agree that Rolex, especially lately, they don't really push the envelope or surprise us in terms of their designs. But I'm not talking about that today. Hi everyone and welcome to Shaluso, and today I'm talking about 3 times that Rolex surprised us with their design moves. Now of course I know these aren't the only 3 times, so definitely let me know in the comments below what examples you have of times where Rolex has actually given us something surprising or unexpected, or just gone against sort of their usual pattern of very slow evolution in when they've had a new release. I'd love to know you guys' thoughts in the comments below. But let's get started, and starting with my personal favorite of the sports Rolexes at least, and that is the Rolex Yachtmaster. So back at the end of the 1980s, even though Rolex had just released the 16610 in 1988, they were already realizing that their watches were definitely moving more to be luxury watches versus tool watches. So they thought to themselves, all right, let's move the Submariner up market. Let's turn it into a proper luxury watch. However, for whatever reason, in 1992, they decided to can the idea and that they weren't going to replace the Submariner. And in fact, the 16610 survived all the way up until 2008, so it lasted 20 years in production. But that's not the end of the story, because instead of just abandoning the project, they resurrected an old dead project, which was the Yachtmaster. Now, the Yachtmaster originally was a variant on the Daytona in the 60s, geared towards regatta timers. And in 1992, Rolex had a luxurious, water-resistant watch on their hands, so they released it as the Yachtmaster. And when you look at it, it's almost like a window into the alternate reality where Rolex realized and actioned this sort of new luxury position about 20 years earlier than when they actually did. First off, it was released entirely in yellow gold. So at that time, it was that and the day date that were really the only models available only in precious metal. In addition to that, it had a relieved bezel. No little aluminum inserts for this. No, it was a solid gold relieved bezel, and it also featured the introduction of the maxi dial and the maxi hands, something that wouldn't feature on the Submariner until 2005 with the Kermit. It even features a more Daytona-esque case, or a similar case to the Day-Date as well, where it's much more curvaceous. So it's definitely a different personality to the Submariner, and it featured polished center links, something that wouldn't debut on other professional models until much later. And they actually kept it in this luxury positioning for about 7 years. It wasn't until the end of the 90s in which they released the steel version, and then in the early 2000s they released the two-tone. So they really were committed to sort of having their cake and eat it too, because on the one hand they had their 16610, which was just an evolution of its predecessor aesthetically, but on the other hand they also had this more drastic change that they were selling right alongside it. And while it was never as popular as the Submariner, again, it gives us that window into what could have been and to what Rolex was trialing out for quite a while to see if it stuck. And the beautiful thing is that since it didn't really stick in the same way that the Submariner has, it means also that it isn't beholden to the crazy premiums. If you look on the pre-owned market, most of these sell for around retail or only a little bit over. It's not the insane premiums that you see for a Submariner. And you still get a very good looking watch, still has 100 meters water resistance, and it's maintained that design from 1992 up until now. The only real changes have been in the quality of the bracelet. The overall design has been largely the same. So in that sense, it's typical Rolex, but its introduction was definitely a seismic shift. And if they'd have actually replaced the Submariner with that, or done a move like that in the last few years, for example, I think the internet would probably break. Next on the list, we have the Rolex Explorer II, and I'm not talking about the one that was just released in 2021. I'm talking about its immediate predecessor, which looks almost the same as the one that was released in 2021. The big difference though is that its predecessor, the 216570, was very different from its predecessor. And the biggest difference, especially when it comes to Rolex's modus operandi when it comes to design, was that they actually paid homage to a historical model. In changing the shape and the color of the GMT hand from red and being nearly the same as the GMT Master 2 to this orange hand that was very stylized, they were paying homage to the original 1971 model. And this is something, again, that Rolex isn't really known for doing. You know, they're often moving forward, call it snail pace, but they're always moving forward for the most part, they very rarely backtrack, and even more rarely do they actually pay homage to an older model. They're usually looking at making the next icon instead of looking back at the previous one. That's kind of what they have Tudor for. But with the 2011 model, they were able to differentiate it more from its predecessor and from the GMT Master. And in addition to that, they also increased the size by 2mm, gave it the super case, gave it the maxi dial. If they did that sort of change on the current one, think about it. They'd be going to a 44mm. They'd be maybe introducing a new handset entirely, perhaps the more squared off hands like they had on the original 70s models, instead of the Mercedes hands that they have now. So something like this, again, very different from what we're used to from Rolex, and something that if it happened today would make much more ripples in terms of just people's general surprise at a non-incremental change. But of course, the biggest surprise when it comes to Rolex is probably the most un-Rolex release of the 21st century, and that is the Rolex Cellini Prince. First off, it's a Cellini. It's a dress watch. It's not something that people generally associate with Rolex. But much more than that, it was rectangular. It had a small second sub-dial that was actually lower than the regular hours and minutes, instead of being something that the hours and minutes go over. It was Deco inspired from the 1920s instead of most of the current professional range, for example, that has its roots in the 1950s. But the biggest difference is when you turn it around, because not only did it have a sapphire case back, it was a manual wind movement. So forget about the perpetual and oyster perpetual. Obviously it wasn't high water resistant, so not much oyster going on there. And more importantly though, it was so beautifully decorated. They actually took the time to decorate the movement to match the patterns that you would find on each individual dial variant. This is a level of detail that people just aren't used to with Rolex. And it's the sort of thing that I'd really like to see more of in the future, and I think with the Cellini they can do that. At the end of the day, whatever you think of it, their whole incremental approach on the professional series is because they don't want to ruin the winning formula. But since they've never really hit that with the Cellini, they have more freedom, more scope to experiment, and I'd love to see them try a few more different things or bring back something like the Cellini Prince in a more modern iteration, perhaps something that's a bit more practical than say a Calatrava or a Lange 1. I really want to see what Rolex can do if they spread their wings, and the Cellini is really their last hope of playing around with aesthetics until they find that perfect thing and then sort of set it in stone. But let me know in the comments below, what do you think of these three models? What do you think of Rolex's approach of incremental change versus radical change? And which Rolex model would you like to see them take a more, shall we say, aggressive approach in terms of redesigning and updating, as opposed to their usual approach that they do with most of their watches? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more pictures and infographics of watches, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shaluso. If you want to see more videos of watches, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification button as well so you know when the next video comes out. In any case, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.